Howdy gang, Kurt here. Today I wanted to talk about what I've been up to this quarantine besides growing out this grotesque beard and gnarly hair. And that of course is sourdough bread making. Now if you know me, you know I can't get enough of sandwiches. I will literally eat them every day. I can't get enough of them. But there's just one tiny little problem when the world's on lockdown. Bread is really hard to come by. Most stores were running out in the area, so I decided, what better way to spend my time during this quarantine than by learning to make sourdough? What a great use of my time. It only took me 2 months to figure it out and I'm okay. Disclaimer, this recipe is from my own novice perspective. I've kind of taken it from a lot of different places. This is one of those things where it works for me, but I'm sure it's not perfect. If there's anything I've learned in this whole process, it's that there is infinite room for creativity and ways to improve your process. So with my little disclaimer out of the way, let's begin.
The first step in getting a sourdough going is to have a starter active and ready. Getting a starter to this point isn't the hardest thing in the world, but it is a separate topic entirely. So if you'd like me to cover it, just request it. Right now we are feeding our starter at 10 in the morning. First I like to drop 50 grams of whole wheat flour and then follow it up with 50 grams of my bread or strong flour. Next followed up with 100 grams of water. I go a little bit over, but it's fine. Just get as close as you can. Now let's just whip up that bad boy, stir it all together, get it nice and consistent. You can work the sides a little bit to remove some of the excess, so that way you can view it off the side a lot easier later. A somewhat optional step right here where I mark it. This is just so you can see your growth a little bit later on and kind of keep an eye on your starter. After finishing our feeding of our starter, we're going to put it into our oven with the light on. This is just to give it a warm spot for later. Next up is the Autolyse. Begin by dumping 200 grams of whole wheat flour, then put in 800 grams of your bread flour. I've also heard this called strong flour as well. Keep in mind I'm giving you guys the recipe for 2 loaves, so you can always half it if you just want one. Follow that up with 750 grams of water. You can filter it, but I always just take it from the tap. Made a bit of a mistake by not mixing the flours before adding in the water. A bit of a goof on my part, but it should be fine in the end. So using your hand, you want to start working the flour with the water. Keep in mind you're not kneading the dough at all, you're just trying to get it fully hydrated. For my recipe, I always Autolyse 4 hours ahead of time before introducing my starter, but I've seen some people do as little as 1, and I've seen some people do it not at all. It's really up to personal preference. Next, throw it into your oven. The oven is really just a warm spot to keep everything nice and in temp. Mine sits around 78, 75 degrees. Next up, we're going to prep for seasoning. First up, minced onion, then some minced garlic, using a little bit of magic on this one. Then some salt that I'm too distracted to pay attention to, and then the rosemary. I've really found that having a hint of rosemary adds a lot to the complexity and the flavor of your dough, so we're adding it. Be sure to pick apart your rosemary so that way you have no stems involved, and then just go at it with a knife. Keep going until you get to your desired level of fineness, and admire your work. Once your starter is nice and risen, you're going to start mixing your dough. Start by adding in your starter to the Autolyse dough. Try to get some good coverage all around the top so that way you can get it into every little nook and cranny. Now let's add our seasonings. 20 grams of salt ought to do it, followed by 10 grams of minced onion, 10 grams of minced garlic, and as much rosemary as you can stomach. This really is the experimentation phase of the game, so have fun with it. It's time our starter and dough got properly acquainted with each other. So with a wet hand, go in and start dimpling into your dough. Use any technique that you're comfortable with, just make sure that you're not kneading the dough together. We're just trying to get it all incorporated with each other. So pinch it, slap it, just make sure it's having a good time. Now begins the rhubarb method. To do this, we're going to be picking up and slapping and scooping a lot. It may not look like much, but this is working the entire dough and getting things evenly distributed. From what I found online, knead versus no knead recipes are very controversial, but I've found the best results doing this. Just be sure your arms are nice and rested before doing this because this can be really tiring on the biceps. I like to go at this for about 4 to 5 minutes. I've also seen some people do this in segments, so they'll do it for maybe 2 minutes or so, take a break, come back 15 minutes later and work it again for another 2 or so minutes, but ultimately it's up to the user on how much they want to do this. A fun little side note, you'll see all this residue that's left over. That's really bad. That'll lead to clumps in your dough later on. So I recommend moving it to another bowl. All you need to do is get a wet hand and start working the sides. This should release tension with this original bowl, and then you can just lift it right up nice and easy and move it into your new bowl, nice and clean. Once we're done, throw this back in the oven for another 15 minutes before we start our first fold. Folding is what's going to give us our coveted oven spring, which is the rise of the bread whenever it's being baked in the oven. With wet hands, you're going to stretch and fold, just like that. I didn't get it all here in this first take, but I'll kind of splice everything together. You're going to stretch and fold all 4 sides of this dough, then put it back on the oven for its remaining time. Folds 1 and 2 will be spaced 15 minutes apart, and any additional folds after that will be 30 minutes. Unfortunately, it took me all the way till fold 4 to figure out a good filming angle, but this one's all in one take. You should see everything. You can do as many or as little folds as you want. I do recommend that you do at least 3 though. I always go up to 5, but I've seen some people go all the way up to 8. In theory, the more folds that you give your dough, the more oven spring you should experience in the oven. This will ultimately lead to a more open crumb at the end. From the time you mix your starter into your dough, you're doing what's called bulk fermentation. My bulk fermentation period lasts for 4 hours in total, so once we finish fold number 5, we let it sit for another 2 hours. Once your remaining oven time is done, pull your dough out and get mentally prepared, because this next part's a doozy. Using a wet hand, we're going to dump our dough out onto an unfloured work surface. This work surface can obviously be your counter, but I've seen some people use an entire butcher's block to do it. If you do use your counter, don't worry about the mess because it's pretty easy to clean up. And now begins the pre-shape. Begin by painting a line with your bread flour along the middle. Try to make sure that both sides are pretty even. Using a bench scraper, you're going to cut along the path that you just painted. The reason for this flour is so that way it doesn't stick to your bench scraper. Once you're done with your cutting, you're going to try to pre-shape these rounds into somewhat spheres. Start by doing this kind of twisting motion with your bench scraper and kind of just stabilizing it with your left hand. Since sourdough does have such a high hydration percentage, I do recommend you get your hands and bench scraper wet at this point. I consider this the hardest part of the whole process. The dough is really going to want to stick to everything, but just keep calm and relaxed and keep twisting and you're going to be fine. When you're done, just let them sit uncovered for at least 20 minutes. Our next major endeavor is going to be the proofing process, so let's prep for that right now. We need to heavily flour our proofing baskets. I use Bannatynes now, but I started out using Pyrex and a tea towel, whatever works. On a normal dinner plate, sprinkle out some sesame seed and any other seasonings you want on top. Up next, the final shaping. Start by putting a little bit of flour on the top of both of your rounds, and then just kind of spread it around and get it evenly distributed. Try not to add too much flour, otherwise it won't stick later on. Your hand and bench scraper should be floured this time. I know in the video it has me with wet hands, but don't do that. Using a floured bench scraper, release the edges just to get it off the table, then flip it over, flour side down. Time to get a couple more folds in. Stretch and pull the top one down and put it into the middle. Then do your sides, and then finally the bottom for a completion of 4 folds. When you've completed your 4 folds, try to seal it at the bottom. This is why it's important not to use too much flour. Once you finish sealing it, flip it over with that side down, then try scooting it along the table, then turning it 90 degrees and scooting it some more. Your ultimate goal here is to just get it as spherical as possible and increase your surface tension. The increased surface tension will help increase your oven spring, otherwise all the gases will escape and it'll be a pretty flat loaf. Try to stay as delicate as possible, otherwise you'll lose all the rise that you worked so hard to gain. Once you have your ball formed, pull it from the table and put it top side down into your seasoning. Kind of roll it around and get it as evenly covered as possible. Then toss it seasoned side down into your floured basket. Here's the footage of me doing loaf number 2. This one went a lot smoother than the first one, mostly because I used the appropriate amount of flour. The first one was a big sticky mess. It was sticking to the table, to my hands, all over the place. It was a big pain. Another step that I didn't show you in the first loaf is that I like to seal this bottom side and then flour it in. This just keeps our surface tension intact. Now that we have these both secured in our proofing baskets, put them into a plastic bag. You can do them individually or together like I have them here. Then you can use a rubber band or whatever you have available to secure the top. The reason we put these in the bag is to make sure that it doesn't dry out while it's in the fridge overnight. These are going to be hanging out in your fridge anywhere from 12 to 14 hours, so we'll see you in the morning. Rise and shine, it's baking day. First thing we have to do is to preheat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with whatever item we're baking the bread in. I do all of my baking in a cast iron pot, but I've seen people use Dutch ovens as well as other combo cookers. Side note, if you have a pizza stone, put it underneath your cast iron. This will help prevent the bottom from burning too much. In preparation for bread scoring, I recommend getting some parchment paper and just putting it out onto a normal dinner plate. A good test to see if your dough is ready is to poke into it. You're not looking for it to spring back immediately or to leave a crater. You want it to just flex enough. Since ours is ready, put it onto the plate like so, and then flip it over. Then just remove your proofing basket and get ready to score. Using a razor blade or a kitchen knife, cut at about a 45-degree angle into the dough. You shouldn't be penetrating any more than about 1/4 of an inch. Scoring the dough in certain ways will help us control where we want the steam to release. This can lead to different shapes and patterns, so just let your creativity go free. After your oven and cast iron pot have been heating for 1 hour, remove it and then drop your loaf in. This is why it's nice to use parchment paper, because it prevents your fingers from getting all burned up when you drop it in. Then just put the lid on and put it into your oven for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, it's time to remove the lid. Carefully pull the rack out so you have some space and pull the lid. Through a lot of trial and error, this can definitely be the most nerve-wracking part, because this is the first time you're going to know whether you messed up somewhere along the way. We're then going to put it back into the oven with the lid removed and drop the temperature down to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It can stay in this state anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. Just keep checking it to make sure that you get the right color and you don't burn it. After you've reached your desired color, then turn the oven off, then crack the door open and leave it there for 20 minutes. This will give you a nice crisp crust. Now it's time to cool our loaves. Just put it out onto a wire rack and let it sit for at least 1 hour. I know it's hard to wait that long, but the texture will be all wrong and you'll lose a lot of flavor if you cut in early. Let's give our loaf a thump and listen how we did. Almost perfect. You can hear the hollowness of the loaf, and that's how we know we got a good crumb. Much like with children, your second loaf is always the best. Just like the first one, you want to press into it to make sure you got good spring. Then you're just going to dump it out onto your plate like you did with the first one. In this case, I had an excess amount of flour on the ends, so I kind of flicked it away with my fingers. These longer ones, I haven't really gotten super sophisticated with my scoring technique yet, so I just kind of give it 3 basic cuts and try to make sure that they're deep enough. Once the scoring's done, put it into the oven with the lid on for 20 minutes. Always the most nerve-wracking portion, when you pull the lid. Now just leave it in there for about 15 more minutes and we'll be golden. Once again, crack the door open for another 20 minutes with the oven off. This really helps the crust complete. It is a long 20 minutes though. It just sits in there, mocking you for your impatience, telling you you're not good enough, telling you that you're not gonna make it. Wars have been started and ended in a shorter period of time than 20 minutes. The gates of hell themselves could open up in 20 minutes. I gotta pull this right now. I gotta do it right now. If I don't pull this loaf right now, the fate of my life. And now that you've patiently waited 20 minutes, boom, paradise. Just listen to that crunch and thump. It makes all the patience totally worth it. Hope you guys have enjoyed listening to my ramblings for 14 minutes or so. I had a great time making this video. It took me a lot of effort, a lot of failure to get to this point, so don't feel bad if you don't get it right away. Like I said, there's always things that you can do to improve and perfect your process. Even if your loaf isn't the prettiest, it's always what's on the inside that counts. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see y'all later.